Y'all, Jamie from Country Diggers here. Today we're going to do a little history on the Donner Party. I went back in, I think it was 2006, I think, and up to the Sierra Nevadas where the Donner Party was, and I got this little keepsake token right here. I did not dig it. I bought it. And we're going to do a little history on the Donner Party. All right. Stay tuned. All right. This is an article from History Stories by Evan Andrews in January 2020. 10 things you should know about the Donner Party. The Donner Party started its trip dangerously late in the pioneer season. Travel on the California Trail followed a tight schedule. Immigrants needed to head west late enough in the spring for there to be grass available for their pack animals, but also early enough so they could cross the treacherous western mountain passes before winter. The sweet spot for the departure was usually sometime in mid to late April, yet for unknown reasons, the core of what became the Donner Party didn't leave their jumping off point at Independence, Missouri until May 12th. They were the last major pioneer train of 1846. And their late start left them with very little margin for error. I am beginning to feel alarmed at the tardiness of our movements, one of the immigrants wrote, and fearful that winter will find us in the snowy mountains of California. They left behind schedule after taking an untested shortcut. After reaching Wyoming, most California-bound pioneers followed a route that swooped north through Idaho before turning south and moving across Nevada. In 1846, however, a dishonest guidebook author named Lansford Hastings was promoting a straighter and supposedly quicker path that cut through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Salt Lake Desert. There was just one problem. No one had ever traveled this Hastings cutoff before with wagons, not even Hastings himself. Despite the obvious risk, and against the warnings of James Clyman, an experienced mountain man, the 20 Donner Party wagons elected to break off from the usual route and gamble on Hastings' back road. The decision proved disastrous. The immigrants were forced to blaze much of the trail themselves by cutting down trees, and they nearly died of thirst during a 5-day crossing of the Salt Desert. Rather than saving them time, Hastings' shortcut ended up adding nearly a month to the Donner Party journey. Now, it might have been, from what happened there, this is my opinion, from what happened to the Donner Party, if they had to take that shortcut, I think it would have been better for them to die of thirst in the desert than do what they did later. But that's my opinion. All right. The immigrants lost a race against weather by just a few days. Despite the Hastings cutoff debacle, most of the Donner Party still managed to reach the slopes of the Sierra Nevada by early November 1846. Only a scant 100 miles remained in their trek, but before the pioneers had a chance to drive their wagons through the mountains, an early blizzard blanketed the Sierras in several feet of snow. Mountain passes that were navigable just a day earlier, soon transformed into icy roadblocks, forcing the Donner Party to retreat to nearby Truckee Lake and wait out the winter in ramshackle tents and cabins. Much of the group's supplies and livestock had already been lost on the trail, and it wasn't long before the first settlers began to perish from starvation. The majority of the Donner Party immigrants were children. Like most pioneer trains, the Donner Party was largely made up of family wagons packed with young children and adolescents. Of the 81 people who became stranded at Truckee Lake, more than half were younger than 18 years old, and 6 were infants. Children also made up the vast majority of the Donner Party's eventual survivors. One of them, 1-year-old Isabella Breen, would go on to live until 1935. A few pioneers managed to hike safely. On December 16, 1846, more than a month after they became snowbound, 15 of the strongest members of the Donner Party strapped on makeshift snowshoes and tried to walk out of the mountains to find help. After wandering the frozen landscape for several days, they were left starving and on the verge of collapse. The hikers resigned themselves to cannibalism and considered drawing lots for a human sacrifice or even having 2 of the men square off in a duel. Several members of the party soon died naturally, however. So the survivors roasted and consumed their corpses. My opinion, and me, this is personal. If I'm ever starving, I pray that I die before I turn to cannibalism. I pray I die before that. The gruesome meat gave them the energy they required, and following a month of walking, 7 of the original 15 made it to a ranch in California and helped organize rescue efforts. Historians would later dub their desperate hike the Forlorn Hope. A Donner Party member murdered 2 people for use as food. This is a very sick story, but, it happened. During the Forlorn Hope expedition, the hiking party included a pair of Indians named Salvador and Lewis, both of whom had joined up with the Donner Party shortly before they became snowbound. The natives refused to engage in cannibalism, which they had the right set of mind and morals not to do that. And Salvador and Lewis later ran off out of fear that they might be murdered once the others ran out of meat. Instead, when the duo was found days later, exhausted and lying in the snow, I'd rather die than do what the Donner Party did. A hiking party member named William Foster shot both of them in the head. The Indians were then butchered and eaten by the hikers. It was the only time during the entire winter that people were murdered for use as food. Not all of the immigrants engaged in cannibalism. As their supplies dwindled, the Donner Party, stranded at Truckee Lake, resorted to eating increasingly grotesque meals. They slaughtered their pack animals, cooked their dogs, gnawed on leftover bones, and even boiled the animal hide roofs of their cabins into a foul paste. Several people died from malnutrition, but the rest managed to subsist on morsels of boiled leather and tree bark until rescue parties arrived in February and March of 1847. Not all of the settlers were strong enough to escape, however, and those left behind were forced to cannibalize the frozen corpses of their comrades while waiting for further help. All told, roughly half of the Donner Party survivors eventually resorted to eating human flesh. I think this cannibalism too, it affects your mind and makes you do things, makes you go crazy. You have to be crazy to do that anyway. The rescue process took over 2 months. Of the 5 months the Donner Party spent trapped in the mountains, nearly half of it took place after they had been located by rescuers. The first relief parties reached the settlers in February 1847, but since pack animals were unable to navigate the deep snowdrifts, they only brought whatever food and supplies they could carry. By then, many of the party were too weak to travel, and several died while trying to walk out of the mountains. 4 relief teams and more than 2.5 months were eventually required to shepherd all of the Donner Party survivors back to civilization. The last to be rescued was Louis Keseberg, a Persian pioneer who was found in April 1847, supposedly half mad and surrounded by the cannibalized bodies of his former companions. Keseberg was later accused of having murdered the other immigrants for use as food, but the charges were never proven. One rescuer single-handedly led 9 survivors out of the mountains. Perhaps the most famous of the Donner Party survivors was John Stark, a burly California settler who took part in the Third Relief Party. In early March 1847, he and 2 other rescuers stumbled upon immigrants, mostly kids, who had been left in the mountains by an earlier relief group. I tell you, I would have took the kids. If I was in the rescue party, I would have took the kids and left the adults there. Because from what they did, it was horrible. Okay. The 2 other rescuers each grabbed a single child and started hoofing it back down the slope. But Stark was unwilling to leave anyone behind. Instead, he rallied the adults, gathered the rest of the children, and began guiding the group single-handedly. Most of the kids were too weak to walk, so Stark took to carrying two of them at a time for a few yards, then setting them down in the snow and going back for others. He continued the grueling process all the way down the mountain and eventually led all 9 of his charges to safety. Speaking of the incident years later, one of the survivors credited her rescue to nobody but God and Stark and the Virgin Mary. Only 2 families made it through the ordeal intact. Of the 81 pioneers who began the Donner Party's horrific winter in the Sierra Nevada, only 45 managed to walk out alive. The ordeal proved particularly costly for the group's 15 solo travelers, but all but 2 of them died. But it also took a tragic toll on the families. George and Jacob Donner, both of their wives, and 4 of their children all perished. Pioneer William Eddy, meanwhile, lost his wife and 2 kids. Nearly a dozen families had made up the Donner Party wagon, but only 2, the Reeds and the Breens, managed to arrive in California without suffering a single death. After examining remains from the Alder Creek campsite, researchers in 2010 announced that they had been unable to find any human bones or other physical evidence of cannibalism. The researchers themselves clarified, however, that the absence of archaeological evidence did not rule out the possibility that cannibalism had occurred, especially given the extensive contemporary accounts by members of the rescue parties and the survivors themselves. Hope y'all enjoyed. I know it was gruesome, but that's history for you, the good and the bad. See you back.